Hey guys, John here, and welcome back to the VPS Avenger 2 Master Course. Today's video is all about the built-in effects Avenger has to offer and how the routing system works as well. Avenger has up to 4 rack slots, a send effects rack, and a master effects rack, all with 8 slots each, which basically means Avenger is capable of having a total of 48 effect slots. Effects can be ran in serial or parallel and even sent out on aux buses for extra control, so let's get started. As I mentioned in the oscillator video, this panel over here to the right of our oscillator is the routing panel. So here's where we determine where the selected oscillator will be sent to. For effects, we have lots of different choices that we're going to be covering in this video. So right now, we're routing oscillator 1 to effects 1 right over here. So if we're ever unsure where exactly that is, we can always right-click it and Avenger will show us exactly where that is. Here we have our first effects rack. As we can see, it's called FX1, and we have 8 slots to choose from. So let's start adding some effects to our rack here. So we'll start on the first one, and let's right-click. And as we notice, this menu opens up, and all these different effects are sorted by their category. So we have reverb delay, modulation, distortion, dynamic, and stereo stuff. One of my personal favorites is under the modulation category is this vintage chorus. Let's go ahead and select this guy. And now as we can see, the window to the right of the effects slot will be populated with all the controls pertaining to the effects that we choose. So since we're routing an oscillator to an effects rack, we're going to start seeing this mix knob down over here on the right hand side. So basically this is going to determine how strong this effect is, and by default for this effect is going to be 25, so it sounds a little something like this. And then we can increase this here a little bit more. We can always bypass the individual effects by clicking on the power button. And we also have a gain knob on the right hand side. And for whatever reason, if we want to remove an effect that we already added, all we have to do is right click into this menu again and then go over here under stereo at the very bottom where it says no effects, and go ahead and click that and it will remove the effect. All right, so let's add another effect to our stack. So let's right-click this here, and underneath the distortion category, let's go ahead and select the multiband distortion. And now these settings have changed to reflect this type of effect. So what we can do is let's distort the lows a little bit, and let's distort the highs a little bit as well. Okay, so that sounds pretty cool so far, but let's say we want something a little bit different. So inside the different effect modules in Avenger, there's lots of cool presets to explore by clicking on Entitled up here at the top of the module. Now for this example, let's go for number 19, that's Snap Boost, and see how that sounds. Pretty cool. So now let's say we want to bypass the entire effect rack, and we can do that by clicking the power button over here on the bottom left hand side. There's also a button with horizontal lines on it to the right that has lots of cool rack presets to choose from, so feel free to check a lot of these out. So now we're in a spot where we might want to start adding some reverbs or delays or something like that. And now we're kind of conflicted with the choice. We could right click the next slot and add a reverb, and that would work just fine. However, it's not very efficient because once we start adding different oscillators, the only way to get them to that reverb is running them first through our chorus and then our multiband, and then finally through that reverb module. And we may not necessarily want that. We could click the plus and add a second effects rack and put reverb on that, but now we're burning up an entire rack just for that reverb. And then if we started adding more reverbs, we're going to start using up more CPU. So a much more efficient way to do this is using send effects. So over here on the right hand side, we have our send rack. Now here you can see I have reverb and delay, and we also have another 8 slots to choose from. So to send our oscillator to this reverb module, we need to go to our routing panel and turn the send on. So clicking this button right over here. Now if this isn't shown for you, you might need to select it from the plus menu up here. And if you still don't see it, make sure you actually have an effect on the send rack. So once it's turned on, we can now use the slider and determine how much of our signal is getting sent to the module. Okay, now something to keep in mind, if we really think about what's going on here, we have an oscillator that's being sent to an effects rack with chorus and then distortion. But we're also sending that same exact oscillator to a send effects rack with reverb. So in this current configuration, the processing of the first effects rack is not going to be sent to the reverb. Only the dry oscillator is being sent to our send reverb. So if we like this routing, then that's cool, that's great. But if we want, we can reroute the output of our send effects to the input of our rack effects via the routing menu at the bottom. So let's take a look at this to understand this a little bit better. So from an init preset, what we can do is change out our saw wave to a sine wave by clicking this a few times, and let's take a listen. So just a basic sine wave, nothing too special. Now down here on the effects rack, we can right click the first slot and navigate to the distortion, and now let's take a listen. So clearly it's not a sine wave anymore, it is now a distorted sine wave. So we can go over here to our routing panel, turn on our delay, and increase the send amount quite a bit. So what we're hearing here is that the first initial sine wave is distorted. However, the delays via the send are not distorted. They're going to be sine waves, and we can even see it up here on the spectrum view. Let's take a look at that again. If we did, however, want these delays to be processed by the first effects rack, what we can do is go here to our send effects, and at the bottom where it says master effects, this is going to be our routing. So we can click this here and then route this to the first effect, and now let's take a listen. So now those delays will be processed by that first chorus and then by that distortion afterwards. So as a quick recap of what we just did, the oscillator signal is sent to the send effects. Then the send effects sends that signal out to the effects rack 1, which is then sent to the master effects and then finally to the output. Now before we take a closer look and talk about the master effects slot, there are a few more routing options that we need to cover. So let's select the first effects slot over here on the left hand side, and at the bottom where it says master effects, let's go ahead and click on that. The first and default option is Master Effects, and this means that this rack will be sent to the Master Effects rack, which has an additional 8 slots and then goes to the output. The next one is going to be Main Output, so if we don't want this rack to be sent to the Master Effects slot for additional processing, we would select Main Output right over here. Below that, we have auxes that we can send the signal to, so setting this up works a little bit differently in different DAWs, but the main idea is sending the signal out of different outputs. I'm in FL Studio, and this is how it would work in this DAW. So for this example, let's start with an init preset, and then let's right click on our first effect slot and let's add a delay, and let's crank up the mix a little bit as well. And let's also right click this here and add some reverb. Give it a good amount of mix as well. Something kind of like that. So from here, what we need to do is navigate to the bottom and let's select aux 1 and let's play a few notes. So it sounds exactly the same. So what's actually happening is that this is getting sent down to aux 1, but we need to tell FL Studio what to do with that information. So up here on the wrapper where the gear is, let's go ahead and click that, and then let's click the center one, and then down here in the processing tab, we see some different outputs. Now, if we scroll here, we see the master, we see the 4 auxes, and we also see the drums down here if we want to route our drums externally. So we're going to be using aux 1, and these are labeled with positive and negative numbers, right? So if we go through the positive number, so we select this first one, what's going to happen is that signal is going to get sent to the first fader to the right of our signal, as we can see down over here. Now, if we want this to happen on the fader to the left, that's where we would go into negative numbers. So now the information is going down here on the left-hand side. So let's keep this on 1 for now and navigate back to Avenger. So what's actually happening in that example is that the first oscillator is getting sent to the first effects rack, and then that output is getting sent to a different one called aux 1, and we change the output on aux 1 to 1 fader to the right of Avenger. So if we want to do something a little bit different, so for example, let's use send effects in this case. So we can turn on our reverb send and our delay send, increase these pretty substantially. And if we go back to our gear icon that we were just at, and we can see this is still mapped. So our first aux 1 is going to 1, so 1 fader to the right. Now going back over here, all we have to do is go to our send rack and then go down here to the output, click master effects, and now click aux 1, and now take a look at what happens on the faders. So here we have our dry signal, and then on our next fader we have the reverb and the delay. Definitely pretty cool. So now let's take a look at our master effects slot, and this is yet another rack of an additional 8 slots. So this rack is useful for global effects that we want to have on our sound. Think of things like EQ, compression, maybe some distortion, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's really up to you what you want to use this rack for, but the idea is that this rack should be used for the final effects processing of our patch. The master effects rack output cannot be assigned. If you click down here, nothing is going to happen, and that's because it's hardwired to go to the output because this is the final output processing. And speaking of routing again, the menu is context sensitive, meaning that if we try to route FX Rack 1 to FX Rack 2 and we don't see the option appear, that's because FX Rack 2 has not been created yet. So for example, if we're in FX1 and we want to go to FX2, we don't see anything here. We have to click the plus and actually create FX2 for us to see it down here on this list. And the same thing goes for routing oscillators to the effects rack other than the first one, because the first one is there by default. Okay, so now that we understand how the routing works inside Avenger, let's take a look at a few cool effects I really like. So we're not going to be going over every single effect inside Avenger as there's quite a lot of them in there, but for these examples, we're going to be sticking to one effects rack as we're just going to be checking out individual modules. There's going to be lots of reverbs to choose from this list here, but I particularly like the sound of the AA reverb, which also includes shimmer. So let's go ahead and click this guy down over here, and let's take a listen. Let's add some of that shimmer, which is going to pitch shift the tail of the reverb. And let's add some unison as well. And then let's remove the shimmer and just see what the reverb sounds like itself. We can also increase the time as well and reduce the pre-delay just by a little bit here. Another really cool one that I particularly like, if we right-click this first slot here and down in the reverb delay category, is going to be quantum effects. Now, this thing is just insane. And what we're looking at here is a very advanced delay module where we can process delays in a lot of different ways. So over here on the left-hand side, we have 3 different delay pages and a master. But for now, let's look at this first delay. And in this effects window, we can see some very common delay parameters. So let's set our delay time to 1/4, and let's set our feedback a little bit higher than 50, maybe something like 65% or something like that. And let's take a listen here. Okay, so we have a basic delay, and now a lot of the fun is going to happen down here in the center. So here we have 3 slots, and kind of think of these things like sequenced effects that process the delays that we have. Now let's set slot 1 down to 1/4 as well. And under this different type of effects menu, we have lots of cool stuff to go through. So for example, let's check out the low pass. And now these different sequences are going to be how we change it. So if we did something kind of like this, take a listen to our sound now. Or we can go the opposite way, something like that. Let's go ascending. Basically opening up the filter as the delays continue on. Now, another cool one, if we click this list again, is the chorus. So let's maybe go something kind of like this, a little bit better drawn, I suppose. So with each delay, we're adding more and more chorus to it. So it's a really cool concept to kind of drill in your head. Now, another one that I really like as well is down here at the bottom called stutter. Now, let's kind of make these all down here at the bottom, and let's give this one pretty substantially a good value right here and take a listen and see what that sounds like. Right, so we can do interesting rhythmic things. So if you did something kind of like this here, kind of every other one, something kind of like this here, it'd be kind of interesting. We can see where the delays add based on this white line right over here at the top. And another really cool one as well is going to be this rate hard. So again, let's kind of clear this out like that. And then maybe on this one over here, let's give it a good amount of value. And again, we can do something kind of rhythmically like this here, which is going to be a lot of fun. And we can also change where this thing is going to be moving from. So right now we're going forward. We can go down to the mode and we can reverse it, for example. So an entire video can be made out of just this effects module because it's really cool and it's really advanced. It's a lot of fun to play with, but maybe we'll do that at another time, but definitely spend some time with this quantum effects. It's really, really crazy. You can make some crazy patches with this thing. So one of my favorites in the modulation category, if you probably don't know by now, is going to be this vintage chorus. I think this one sounds really, really cool. So we just have a saw wave, right? And we turn the mix up all the way to the top. So there's really one effect and the mix all the way at the top. I use this one pretty frequently. It's kind of one of my go-to effects inside Avenger. I think it sounds really good. And especially if you add a little bit of unison to it as well. It just has that richness to it. Definitely one of my favorites. Another really cool effect in the modulation category is this Rotary Sim down over here. So if we ever wanted to make a fast organ, so by default we have the saw wave, so we can clear all this thing out, maybe give our first sine wave, something like this, and start kind of adding the harmonics of an organ. So something kind of similar, right? A little quick, easy organ. Now to add the final touch on this, let's go to this effects, let's right click, and let's go to our Rotary Sim, and now take a listen to this. Definitely pretty cool. So let's bring up our gain just a bit here. Let's give it a little bit of release. And what we can do as well is, I guess since we're on this effects thing, we can add a reverb to kind of really tie this in here. So like I said, one of my favorites is this AA reverb. And something else I'll probably do as well is maybe we'd like to squash this just a little bit. So we can maybe right click this here, add a compressor, bring our threshold down just a little bit. Something kind of like that. Maybe a little bit of our output gain. Yeah, so a really cool way to make an organ. I'd probably do the effects slightly different, but keep in mind this rotary effect is really cool and there's lots of different options to go through. So underneath the distortion category, there's a lot of cool stuff to check out. The main distortion is really cool. I use that pretty frequently. However, there's one that really caught my eye, and this is going to be the Vinylizer. So if we turn this thing on our effects rack, we're not going to hear anything at first because we have to start setting a couple things up. So let's go down here to the noise. Let's bring this up a little bit here. And then a little bit of scratch. And then a little bit of crackle. Then once we set it here, it's going to stop, right? And once we start playing some notes, we're going to hear it again, and then it's also going to stop. Now, if you like this functionality of it stopping once we release the notes of our keyboard, that's great. However, if we want to always keep this on and maybe use this for other types of sound design, we have the option to do that with auto off. So we just uncheck this here. And you can listen to that and make whatever you like with it for as long as you would like. Definitely a really cool sound. So let's take a look at the dynamic section, which we're going to find compression, EQ, filters, limiters, so on and so forth. Now, one of the ones that I really found was really cool is going to be this mini chain. So let's go ahead and select this and take a listen to see what that sounds like with a little bit of unison. So this is basically a time-based sidechain. Now, we have this graph, which is really cool. If we grab this node and turn it to the left and take a listen to see how that sounds. We can really customize it how we want to. Now we have a time scale down up here, so by default it's going to be 1/4. We can change it to 1/2 or 1/8. And then on the bottom left-hand side, we have a mix slider or a mix knob where we can kind of mix the sound in so we don't want it completely so harsh. We can kind of dial this down just a little bit. And this bottom node is also movable, as well as the tension of this curve here. So definitely spend some time with this one. It's really cool to make some of those type of trance-gated patches. It's really fun. And speaking of which, another really cool one down in the dynamics area here is going to be this Trancegate. Now, this is one of my favorites, so let's also add some unison here, maybe a little bit of release, and let's take a listen to see how that sounds. So we have this pulsing right now. If we look down here, it's going to be the step sequencer 1, so let's click down here on the step sequencer 1, and we have all these bars, which is going to be basically on, off, on, off. All right, so we can maybe make something rhythmic, something like this here. And also maybe we can send a little bit to our reverb. And then we can always right click this here, add a little bit of chorus for some extra fun. We can always modulate this as well. If you grab our modulation source and bring it to our cutoff, increase the depth just a little bit here. And with a little bit of drums in the background. So that is a lot of fun to play with. And if we take a look underneath the stereo section, we have a few different modules, one of them being this stereo MTX, which is really cool. We can delay the left speaker, the right speaker, we can change the mono level and the stereo level, and a mix of all that all together, which is really useful because we can kind of see what our mix would sound like in mono, sometimes to check things, and also sometimes to edit things and maybe make our patch sound a little bit different. Definitely check this one out. Well, all right, guys, that wraps it up for this video. I hope you now have a better understanding of the effects and the effects routing inside Avenger 2. I highly recommend to spend some time with each and every module and kind of get to know it, as there's so much to explore. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and we'll see you in the next video.